listening to WHPK 88.5 FM Chicago. This is Radical Minds. Radical Minds investigates the interlocking political, economic, and social problems facing modern society for a ruthless critique of everything existing. We are an ongoing discussion of activists, academics, and intellectuals on issues pertinent to the left, past, present, and future. This week, we are joined in the studio by Chris Cutrone, who is the president and a founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and author of several articles which will be published soon in a collection called Marxism in the Age of Trump. And today he's here to talk to us about his article, which appeared in the 102nd edition of the Platypus Review, The End of the Gilded Age, Discontents with the Second Industrial Revolution. So thank you for coming on the show, Chris.
Thank you.
Good.
All right, so I'm gonna read this essay that was just published in December of 2017. The End of the Gilded Age, Discontents of the Second Industrial Revolution Today. The account of history is the theory of the present. How did we get here, and what tasks remain from the past that, however, appear to be new today? As Adorno put it, the new is the old in distress. This is true of capitalism and its crisis now. The present crisis is a crisis of the world system of capitalism that emerged in the 20th century, a crisis of the capitalist world created by the Second Industrial Revolution at the end of the 19th century. In fits and starts, such as the two world wars and the Cold War, but nonetheless consistently and inexorably, that system has been led by the countries newly industrialized at the end of the 19th century, the United States, Germany, and Japan. All three have come to be in crisis in the early 21st century. The crisis of the European Union can be regarded as a crisis of the management of German capital. David Harvey, in his 1990 book, The Condition of Postmodernity, written and published in the heyday of neoliberalism, regarded the history of capitalism as a succession of regimes of accumulation, concrete forms for socially and politically mediating the need to accumulate capital in its valorization process. But since, according to Marxism, capitalism is itself a form of social contradiction and thus a crisis and decay of society and politics, each successive form of capitalism takes up and perpetuates the crisis of the preceding form, however in an altered way. Capitalism really is a matter of kicking the can down the road, apparently indefinitely. But the banging can eventually returns, and we must ultimately pay the added costs of its deferral. The characterization by critical contemporaries of the late 19th to early 20th century era as the Gilded Age expressed its quality as what Kant warned about a century earlier in his 1784 essay on the idea for a universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, namely, quote, the danger that the vitality of mankind may go to sleep. Everything good that is not based on a morally good disposition, however, is nothing but pretense and glittering misery, close quote. Gilded Age capitalism was such glittering misery. This quality of capitalism continues today, especially in the last generation of neoliberalism whose spell was broken in the recent crisis. Joseph Schumpeter tried to put a happy face on capitalism by calling it creative destruction, but Marxism recognized to the contrary that it is actually destructive creation, and its destructiveness is not only immediate, but has long-term consequences. The destruction of capitalism is cumulative. It makes claims on future generations that cannot be settled cheaply. It was during the period of the late 19th century Gilded Age that capitalists appeared not as entrepreneurs of production, but as robber barons, an aristocracy of looting. Marx had already mordantly observed that in industrial production, with its high capital requirements, it was not the case that being a captain of industry made you money, but rather that having money made you a captain of industry. In industrial capitalism, it was not, as Adam Smith had thought, production developed by reinvestment of relatively low profits in the long run, with high wages facilitating increased consumption, wealth, in a virtuous cycle, but rather as marginal utility theory developed precisely in this late 19th century era, regarded more cynically, that use values of commodities decrease over time, so that investors in their production better get in early and take their profits out while the going is still good and before it becomes a matter of diminishing returns. The miserable reasoning of what Smith regarded as a mercantile interest, the profiteering of buying cheap and selling dear, that he thought actually constrains and undermines the productivity of wealth in society, and so needed to be overcome as an impediment to growth. Marx pursued, rather, the self-contradiction in what became of Smith's labor theory of value in industrial capitalism. The accelerated technical production of the Industrial Revolution increased along with it the accumulation and concentration of capital, which Marx thought produced a crisis of value in industrial capitalism, and that such production was still socially mediated by the value of wage labor, however anachronistically. Wage labor was inadequate for the social appropriation of industrial production. This was the self-contradiction of the capitalist mode of production in political economic terms, according to Marx. The bourgeois social relations were contradicted by the industrial forces of production. Industrial technique served to increase capital, but this outstripped the actual social productivity of human labor, eliminating workers from production, so that, as Max Horkheimer wryly observed, quote, "Machines have made not work, but the workers superfluous," close quote. Adam Smith's proprietors of stock were only a slight variation on the prior traveling merchants, collecting the products of cottage industry, now gathering the previously disparate producers and factories. They were not capitalists in the Marxist sense of owners of the means of production. The role of the proprietors in Smith's view of production was minimal by comparison to the laborers who were actually making things with increased efficiency. Where Smith would have expected higher productivity to result in the increased value of time in work through cooperation that would not only increase the purchasing power of labor, but also decrease labor time and increase leisure time, what happened for labor instead at a societal level was the pernicious combination of overwork and unemployment, not attributable merely to temporary labor market corrections. Human labor was progressively eliminated from production in absolute and not only relative terms. Increased production was no longer based primarily on human labor power inputs, inefficient cooperation, as Adam Smith's example of the pin factory demonstrated, but rather on the development of science and technology, or what Marx called the general social intellect, objectified in machine production. The combined and uneven, that is to say, self-contradictory development of capitalism is exhibited by the paradoxical phenomena of simultaneously coexisting robots and sweatshops. Industrial development and the accumulation of capital undermine the entire bourgeois social ethos of rewarding productivity through work, the exchange of labor as a commodity. Contrary to Smith's expectation, Marx observed how in capitalism, labor sinks from the most precious to the most wretched of commodities. The workers are expropriated of the value of their labor at a societal level, and not merely through being superexploited by their employers. There is a glaring problem in the development of wealth in society based on the value of labor. The ramifications of this are found in capitalism's social effects. This is what makes capitalists appear ambiguously as performing a social duty as investors, but also as criminals ripping off society, what Smith had warned about, the constant danger of their conspiracy against the public. Bernard Mandeville's 1714 book, Fable of the Bees, a parable of private vices, public benefits, seemed mocked by what was actually happening in the Gilded Age. Were the capitalists really, as today's parlance goes, job creators? Yes and no, as often as not. When President Theodore Roosevelt went after J.P. Morgan for violation of antitrust laws, and Morgan, a Republican supporter, complained, asking what he could do to avoid prosecution by the government, Roosevelt replied with a variation of Robespierre's injunction that if someone feels implicated by the gaze of judgment, it is because he is guilty. Who wouldn't side with Roosevelt's sentiment against the robber baron? But Roosevelt was motivated not by altruism, but what he regarded as necessary policy to make capitalists responsible investors. Build the railroads, just don't rip us off. Marx thought that socialism would allow industrial production to go beyond capital and overcome the need for and value of labor in a socially beneficial and not destructive way. This was a problem of society, not reducible to the criminality of individual capitalists. Even Roosevelt recognized the need for a change in policy beyond the mere curbing of excesses. For Marxism, the accumulation of capital in industrial production was a crisis for bourgeois society, but also an opportunity for changing it. Indeed, realizing the social potential of capitalism was a necessity, a task. It was inevitable. The only question was the depth and breadth of the needed change in society. In the 20th century, the discontents of Gilded Age capitalism of the Second Industrial Revolution led to what Harvey, after Antonio Gramsci, called Fordism, a new regime of accumulation, or concrete form for the valorization process of capital. It was a new and different form of production and consumption, a new economics and new politics, a new culture, a new way of life. The 20th century and its continuing legacy today express unresolved problems inherited from Gilded Age capitalism that Fordist capital was not able to overcome. We suffer today from discontents with the results, not, for instance, of the 16th to 18th century African slave trade, or the 15th century Reconquista of the New World discovery, but rather from, for example, the failure of Reconstruction in the United States after the Civil War, and the late second wave colonialism from the era of what Marxists had called imperialism at the end of the 19th century, hence the problem of so-called neocolonialism. We live in the world created by the early 20th century's attempts to solve those problems. Eric Hobsbawm wrote of the long 19th and short 20th centuries. He regarded 1789 to 1914 as one cycle, and 1914 to 1991 as another. But perhaps we should consider the short 19th century, the core of which runs from the 1820s to the 1870s, from the aftermath of the French Revolution until the U.S. Civil War, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, and the Franco-Prussian War and resulting unification of Germany. And the long 20th century, which began perhaps as early as the 1870s, but certainly by the 1890s, and continued until the recent crisis of the 2000s and 2010s. The high 19th century of liberalism contrasts with the 20th century of state capitalism. In the 1990s, it seemed as if, after the long detour of fascism and communism, that is to say Stalinism, in the 20th century, a responsibly reformed progressive capitalism of the Second Industrial Revolution would finally have its unobstructed day in the sun. The US, Germany, and Japan could inherit a progressively productive world at peace. The mirage of a purported Third Industrial Revolution of the post-World War II mid to late 20th century was revealed to be merely the full flowering of the turn of the 20th century electromagnetic revolution that had succeeded the original Industrial Revolution's thermodynamics. Cybernetics turned out to be the latest expression of liberal democracy. However, steampunk fantasies haunted historical memory in the 1990s. But already in the 1970s, Star Wars, Alien, and Blade Runner showed us the used future of decrepit Fordist capital. Neoliberalism naturalized this. The retrospective view from the present allows for regarding the 20th century as the outcome of the Gilded Age, of the Second Industrial Revolution. But the 20th century was conditioned by the mounting discontents of the Gilded Age and its crisis in the early 20th century, most apocalyptically in the First World War and its aftermath. We still live in the after effects of the crisis that conditioned the 20th century. The inability to overcome the discontents of capital from a century ago still swamp us today. In the late 19th century, United States, the Second Industrial Revolution was governed largely by the Republican Party, which was the combined party of progressive liberalism and big capital. The Democratic Party in this period, by contrast, was the party of the middle class and conservatism. So, for instance, populism as a 1890s depression phenomenon fed into the Democratic Party, with William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats' unsuccessful candidate for president in 1896 and again in 1900. But progressivism emerged as a reform effort from within the Republican Party against manifest problems of liberal capitalism in the 1890s to 1900s, most dramatically under President Theodore Roosevelt. In Europe, discontents with the Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution manifested in the socialist parties of the Second Socialist International. Liberal capitalism was opposed by a mass industrial workers' politics, most significantly in the major party of the Second International, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany. In the UK, discontents with liberalism led to the formation of the Labour Party. These parties had origins in the 1870s, but experienced phenomenal growth, especially in the aftermath of the crisis of the 1890s. Countries drawn into the Second Industrial Revolution more broadly, but on a subordinate subsidiary basis, included the Russian Empire and Italy, which also experienced mass radicalization in the form of new social democratic and socialist parties. However, these new socialist parties also experienced a crisis of their growth in the 1890s, a crisis of their political purpose. Were they, as they claimed, parties of political revolution, or rather of social reform? Eduard Bernstein was the most perspicacious of the commentators on the developments of this period in the 1890s. He regarded the growth of the United Kingdom's workers' movement that led to the formation of the Labour Party as evidence that a revolutionary socialist political party may not be necessary for the transformation of capitalism into socialism. Socialism may socially evolve within capitalism rather than requiring its political overthrow. The eventual election of majority socialist or labor parties may be sufficient to crown the development of the social movement of the working class through its civil society organizations, such as labor unions and other social collectives, such as women's organizations, etc. The 20th century belied the socialist optimism of the late 19th century that Marxism had in common with liberalism. Just as progressivism expressed manifest problems of liberal capitalism, so the new distinctly revolutionary current in socialism, beginning circa 1900, represented by Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, as well as by Eugene Debs, who had converted to Marxism in the late 1890s, expressed discontent with socialist reformism. Luxemburg, for instance, called Eduard Bernstein simply a liberal. What this meant was that Bernstein regarded liberal democracy as politically adequate for the activity of the working class in its struggle for socialism. Bernstein thought that the capitalist interest could be subordinated to a political majority. What Bernstein didn't reckon with was how the working class would become politically split in the crisis of capitalism. In the First World War and the revolutions in Russia, Germany, Italy, and Hungary that broke out in its aftermath in 1917, 1918, and 1919, the former socialist parties of the Second International divided between reformist social democrats and revolutionary communists. In 1919, responding to criticisms of the course of the Russian Revolution, Debs declared that, quote, "From the crown of my head to the soles of my feet, I am a Bolshevik and proud of it," close quote. This is related to how progressivism emerged contemporaneously with the crisis of liberalism. It was acrimonious as well, with incumbent President Taft condemning his challenger, his former friend and colleague Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party candidate for president in 1912, as, quote, "the most dangerous man in America," close quote. It led, via the actual beneficiary of the split among the Republicans, to Woodrow Wilson's more socially conservative, for example avowedly racist, Democratic Party progressivism. Ultimately to Theodore Roosevelt's nephew-in-law, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. The question is the alternative to capitalist progressivism offered by Marxist socialism. In the United States, Eugene Debs' Socialist Party of America sought to intervene with working-class socialism across the division of Republican Party big capitalist liberalism versus Democratic Party middle-class conservatism. Industrial democracy was the term of the socialist opposition under Marxist leadership. As a Marxist, Debs, like Rosa Luxemburg, understood that this pressed a contradiction. Marxism was not an authoritarian collectivist opposition to liberalism, but sought to combine and transcend middle-class conservative reactionary discontents over the destructive effects of capitalism with the revolutionary social potential of the dynamism of big capital. Debs articulated this in his 1900 election manifesto, first delivered as a speech in Chicago on competition versus cooperation. Quote, "The Republican platform is a self-congratulation of the dominant capitalist class. Prosperity galore, give us 4 years more. The Democratic platform is the wail and cry of the perishing middle class, calamity without end. The Social Democratic platform is an indictment of the capitalist system. It is the call to class consciousness and political action of the exploited working class, and it is a ringing declaration in favor of collective ownership of all the means of production and distribution, as the clarion voice of economic freedom." Close quote. Progressivism sought to similarly transcend the liberal capitalist versus conservative populist divide emerging from industrialization, which is why liberals could observe in 1912 that Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party was seeking to usurp the mantles of both William Jennings Bryan's populist Democrats and Debs's socialists. Democrat Woodrow Wilson's election as president was the result of the split among the Republicans between progressives and old-style liberals. This set the stage for the triumph of New Deal progressivism under FDR, however, 20 years later after the crisis of the Great Depression. But FDR's New Dealism, specifically as a Democratic Party phenomenon, combined but did not transcend the split of progressive capitalism with middle-class conservatism. The working class was thus bound in the Democratic Party to both big capital and the middle class. The working class struggle for socialism, found earlier in the old Socialist Party of America, was squeezed out between these two aspects of the progressive New Deal Democrats. Socialism in the United States never recovered from this suppression. The New Deal coalition Democrats became the ruling party in the United States in the high 20th century. The Democrats have tried, ever since FDR, to retain a progressive capitalist alliance of liberal capital with middle-class conservatism. But what happened in the political crisis of the New Deal coalition in the 1960s, signaled by the civil rights movement as well as the U.S.'s losing war in Vietnam, combined with the crisis of capitalism in the 1970s, was that the form of middle-class conservatism changed, and was captured by the Republicans instead. This was not only expressed in the Southern strategy that captured the Dixiecrat middle-class racial conservatives, but also the appeal to law and order that captured the northern urban and suburban working-class ethnics who had previously supported the New Deal Democrats. Subsequently, this has taken the otherwise long-standing form of the old split within liberalism that progressivism represented: progressive liberalism versus conservative liberalism. The conservative liberals have promised the middle class that it will benefit from big capital, whereas the progressive liberals have actively sought policies that will ensure this. But neither the promise nor the policies have been able to prevent the social destruction and hence the conservative reaction of the middle class. Both the Republicans and Democrats have exploited middle-class discontents without satisfying them. The working class has been the passive object of this process, oscillating between big capitalist liberalism and middle-class conservatism. However, in the obscure form of oscillating between greater or lesser support for progressive liberalism, greater or lesser support for the Democrats. Politically, this means the subordination of the working class to the middle class. But which middle class? The 20th century saw the rise of the new middle class of corporate capitalist managers, as opposed to the old middle class of small proprietors as well as of artisanal workers. The old middle class were the petite bourgeoisie, who were always distinct from the new industrial working class ever since the 19th century. So the question in the 20th century became the relation between the proletarianized working class of wage earners and the capitalist managerial middle class. Could the middle class be captured by progressive liberalism? Or would the perennial crisis of capitalism lead instead to populist conservatism? How could populism, whether middle or working class, be neutralized as a disruptive threat to the negotiations of big capitalist politics. From the era of the late 19th century Second International, Debs serves as an example of how a populist could become a socialist, and not a progressive liberal. By contrast, Eduard Bernstein shows how a Marxist could become a progressive liberal, via the liquidation of proletarian socialism, by neglect of the appeal of middle-class conservatism to which the working class could succumb in its trade unionism. The working class is susceptible to middle-class conservatism insofar as it remains attached to a prior form of capitalism, the accumulated ensemble of previous concrete forms of wage labor, that undergoes crisis and is destroyed. Progressivism depends conversely upon the amenability and liberalism of the middle class to go along with changes in capitalism led by big capital. Big capital benefits from all changes anyway. Capitalists can shift their investments or retire into philanthropy, and entire countries can adopt what Lenin called coupon clipping. So the real issue is the struggle to come out on top, or simply not to sink entirely, but keep one's head above water in the next wave of capitalism. Conservatives are always there to try to take advantage of those swamped and potentially left behind, with demagogic appeals to the status quo that people forget was itself once something new. The question is, who are the progressives and who are the conservatives, politically? Perhaps the progressives are the more cunning conservatives, or the conservatives are the more cunning progressives. In the last generation of neoliberalism, the Republicans could plausibly claim to be the true revolutionaries in advancing capitalism, and thus addressed and exploited the manifest liabilities of the Democrats' conservatism. The game is to capture middle-class discontents in progressive capitalist reforms, for example, welfare reform or trade reform. The Republicans did so through the Reagan Revolution, just as the Democrats had done in the 1930s FDR New Deal coalition, through which they had replaced the Republicans as the dominant majority party since the Civil War. Every old conservative was once a new revolutionary in capitalism. Proletarian socialism, Marxism, by contrast, sought to subordinate the middle class to the working class in reappropriating capital, which it proposed could only happen through the dictatorship of the proletariat. The political party for proletarian socialism thus sought to lead the broader masses in social democracy in order to achieve socialism. This would be especially true of the new managerial middle class, which could simply take direction from the working class, where they formerly did so from the capitalists, including from the capitalist state and its state capitalist managerial policies. Thus, the capitalists could be retired into philanthropy. This was the vision of the Second International, from 1889 to 1914, and also of mid-20th century social democratic politics, especially since it was understood by Marxism, for instance by Lenin's conception of contemporary imperialism or monopoly capitalism, that not only the new middle class as corporate employees, but also the working class itself, subsisted not on the value of their own laboring activity, but rather on a cut of the profits of capital, which was granted to them for political reasons through a myriad of government subsidies to prevent revolution, not merely to soften the blows of the business cycle of boom and bust. Theodore Roosevelt called this the need for a square deal, indicatively not a fair deal, not merely enforcing liberal capitalism, but the government actively ameliorating its defects, and understood it explicitly as required to stave off socialism. But Roosevelt had not Marx's vague specter of communism, but Debs's actual mass Socialist Party of America staring him down to draw this political conclusion. It was a rear-guard action, but with a visionary long view. Progressivism was meant to institute political reforms required to be up-to-date with capitalist development. It was a matter not so much of advancing history as catching up with it. In this sense, it still accorded with classical liberalism that the state should follow society and not try to determine it. But since Roosevelt's time, new problems arising from reforms attempted in the 20th century have clouded the issue. However, the essential political predicament of liberal democracy in the industrial era remains. The problem and task of progressive capitalism is the attempt to maintain capitalism through its manifest social and political crisis. The alignment of the working class with the middle class in common capitalist interest with big capital is always temporary and inevitably fraught. There is always a struggle for supremacy in the fractious, politically negotiated social alliance of capital, which will eventually burst forth from the inexorable obsolescence of any and all concrete forms of capitalism in society. The question the capitalists periodically face is, can the conservative reactionary middle class be made to go in peace? For example, to overdose on opioids, and before that on whiskey. It is important to note that the progressives advocated prohibition. Or will it freak out and disrupt society and politics in uncontrollable ways? Trotsky called fascism the petite bourgeoisie run amok. But every old middle class was once a new middle class, just as every old form of wage labor was once a new form of capitalism. The working class's discontents are subsumed under middle class conservatism. The potential for socialism and capitalism thus disappears. The contradiction of capital that Marxism once recognized is submerged. The progressive capitalist political forms that emerged as an alternative to Marxist socialism after the crisis of the Gilded Age and were carried through the 20th century have exhausted themselves in two waves of crisis: the crisis of the 1960s and 70s that led to neoliberalism, and the present crisis of neoliberalism itself in the 2000s, 0s, and 10s. The attempted return to the Gilded Age since the 1980s to 90s has clearly failed, which is why this deeper history leading to the present reasserts itself today. It is undigested. Glenn Beck was not wrong to panic at the sight of Trump and take his ascendancy as the occasion to condemn the progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson from a century ago. Beck counterposed the America of the Founding Fathers, Washington and Jefferson, to that of the progressivism of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, calling the 2016 election the final defeat of the former by the latter, the final defeat of freedom by progress. Neglected by Beck in his division of American history is Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War as a second founding moment of the United States. But the evident desire for return to the apparently more innocent time of the Second Industrial Revolution and its liberal optimism neglects its real discontents and actual crisis in the Gilded Age, which once were expressed by Marxist socialism in the era of the Marxist-led parties of the Second International, including the Socialist Party of America of Eugene Debs, but were captured instead by progressive state capitalism in the 20th century that Beck and other conservative liberals constantly bemoan, regretting its political necessity. Today, the question is the future of that 20th century state capitalism that, no matter how rickety, still dominates the world. Its prospects look grim, China notwithstanding. But actually, it is no more grim than the 20th century itself, or the late 19th century Gilded Age of Second Industrial Revolution capitalism that gave birth to the 20th century. Now, as before, the Republicans and Democrats compete over the political capture of middle-class conservative reaction by big capital in service of a capitalist progress that is none. What disappears is the possibility once recognized by Marxism of the working class, through proletarian socialism, superseding both progressive capital and middle-class reaction. Without it, capitalism is permanent, the middle class under threat periodically runs amok, old tenements are torn down, slums cleared, and new dormitories for the working class are hastily constructed. And in the end, the best we can hope for is another industrial revolution, with all the destruction that it will inevitably bring.
And now we're going to break for a quick public service announcement.
Hello, this is Julia Louis-Dreyfus asking you to join me in helping protect our national parks. Our parks will celebrate their 100th anniversary.
Speaking of the 90s.
No, that's appropriate. Because
Yeah, I know, exactly. I chose it because of Teddy Roosevelt.
Challenges such as air and water pollution,
That too.
development threats outside their boundaries, and inadequate funding. And that's why the National Parks Conservation Association has identified
Good
proposed
choice.
action to help protect the natural and cultural heritage for
Did you
future
know it was
generations.
Julia
Find out more
Dreyfus?
at
Yeah.
www.parks.org.
Oh, not Dreyfus. I mean, I knew it was Parks because I played it the other
Okay.
night. Okay. there was our Gilded Age Parks announcement from the public service announcement, and a quick event announcement. Friday at 6 p.m. in the Bartlett Lounge, which is in the Bartlett building of the University of Chicago campus on the corner of 57th and University, there will be a public discussion on sex and the left, sexual liberation. So please come out for that. And now we can talk, Chris, maybe we can talk a bit about the article you just read. So for those just tuning in, today we have Chris Cutrone of the Platypus Affiliated Society and author of the article, which we read for the first half of the show, at the end of the Gilded Age, Discontents with the Second Industrial Revolution. And so I was thinking, I don't know, Stephanie, if you have some questions, feel free to hop in here. But I wanted to talk a bit first about this idea of regimes of accumulation that you brought up from David Harvey, because I think there can be some difficulty, particularly with how, like, one, what can we learn from characterizing things as, regimes of accumulation, and two, what are these regimes of accumulation? So, for example, with David Harvey, you brought up Fordism, and I think, it would seem kind of, from a layman's perspective, that perhaps, neoliberalism is one of these as well, but then we're also talking about, kind of the thesis of the article, the essay that you just read for us, is that, well, actually we need to consider this as a whole process set in motion by the Second Industrial Revolution. So I was wondering if we could kind of talk about, what is the use of grouping these different periods in that way? Why does it seem as though something like neoliberalism or Fordism stands on its own? And what can we learn from regimes of accumulation?
All right, so, one advantage of Harvey's book, The Condition of Postmodernity, which is from a while back already, from 1990, is that he takes issue with the idea that neoliberalism was somehow anti-Fordism or anti-Keynesian. Milton Friedman had famously declared, "We are all Keynesians now." I always like to bring up the ordo-liberal or archaic liberal Ludwig von Mises, who showed up at the Mount Perlin Society meeting that was attended by Milton Friedman and his mentor Friedrich Hayek, and von Mises ran out of the room screaming, "You're all socialists." Right. In other words, that the ordo-liberals, the godfathers of neoliberalism, who sought to, from a certain perspective, undo the reforms of the 20th century, the Fordist form of capital, or of state capitalism, and to go back to 19th century liberal capitalism. The advantage of Harvey's book was that he recognized that they didn't quite want to do that, nor was it possible. In other words, even if they wanted to do it, it wasn't really possible. That instead, what you had was a kind of mounting series of forms of capitalism accumulating in history. So the idea was that neoliberalism was post-Fordism. It wasn't anti-Fordism, it was post-Fordism, meaning that it actually continued Fordism, but in a transformed way. And neoliberalism was not really a return to the liberal capitalism of the 19th century. The neo is crucially important, meaning neo means different, and usually also means worse, right? So neo is a change, and it's also a degradation.
So speaking of like neoliberalism, for example, if we think of it as, returning to or attempting to return to kind of this late 19th century moment, and perhaps now being kind of a similar moment to like Teddy Roosevelt with Trump, it seems that, to me, one of the key differences that comes out from your essay is that, well, Teddy Roosevelt had Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party staring him down, whereas what was there during neoliberalism? There wasn't really anything. Well, there was something, certainly. I mean, and this is something I wanted to talk about later, maybe, but maybe we can touch on it a bit now, is this idea of the crisis of liberalism and how the middle class's role in that, particularly as kind of like a negative mirror image or something of the working class.
Well, okay, so there are a couple of things. Of course, most of the left would say that one of the things that conditioned Fordism was the Soviet Union, in other words, communism, that somehow communist China and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe forced these reforms on the liberal democratic capitalist world. the advantage that Harvey has over that perspective, although he might agree with that perspective in certain respects, is that, in fact, something that the Soviet Union, communism in the 20th century has in common with Fordism is a form of capital accumulation, a labor regime, a culture. There were a lot of parallels between culture and society and even economics between the capitalist West and the communist East. And that all of these went into crisis starting in the 1970s. In other words, the neoliberal era represented not just a crisis in the West, but also a crisis in the East, of course, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe, and a radical change in policy in communist China towards pursuing socialism by a capitalist road. So there's that. There's also the question of how we understand progressivism, right? So there's populism and progressivism, and they are merged historically by Woodrow Wilson, but they're actually pretty distinct. Meaning, the real question is, why did the traditional middle class in the late 19th century seek a political solution to their problems, right, to the 1890s depression? And how did they do so? And what kind of government policies did they take issue with? They took issue with monetary policy. For instance, the demonetization of silver was a big issue because, again, capitalism was in crisis. It was changing. These new corporations were rising, and the old middle class felt squeezed out. So that had a certain appeal to the old middle class, farmers, for example, small proprietors, whereas progressivism came from someplace else. It came from, the party of big capital, namely the Republican Party. It came out of an understanding that the destructive effects of industrialization could not be addressed simply by trying to restore some old form of liberal democracy. I think that one example would be, what do you do with the trusts, with the monopolies? Do you regulate them or do you break them up? So Theodore Roosevelt called for regulating them, and Woodrow Wilson called for breaking them up. Now, of course, they weren't broken up, really. And so, that's the other kind of irony of history there. And Lenin famously said that socialism would be based on the trusts, not based on going back to an older form of small proprietor production. That was Debs's perspective as well. So Debs said, the Democrats want to break up the trusts, we want to expropriate them, which is very different.
This reminds me of something that Trotsky wrote that I read I think in his History of the Russian Revolution. He talks about how in a revolutionary period, the party puts its capital into circulation, which kind of implies that socialists were kind of bound up in imperialist
as a
accumulation.
Metaphor.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. I guess I had a question that was related to this. So when you mentioned in your article that the Democrats have essentially become the alliance of progressive capitalism and middle class conservatism, and so socialism was basically kind of attempting to intervene in this, socialism led by Debs was attempting to intervene in this sort of antinomy and provide leadership for it, that as an alternative to progressive liberal social democracy. So now that there's this sort of alliance of the two, how does socialism intervene in what we have today?
Right. Well, that's the big question. In other words, the question is, the old contradiction between wage labor and capital seems to have been superseded, or the way I put it, submerged, by this progressive liberal versus conservative liberal, Democratic Party versus Republican Party, and that's why I raised the question: who's conservative, who's progressive in that situation? The Republicans have actually claimed to be, in certain respects, progressive, the true revolutionaries. That was Newt Gingrich's phrase in the 1994 Republican sweep of Congress. And also what they mean by progressive, they see as a kind of, what the Republicans call negatively progressivism, they see as a kind of statism. And what the Democrats regard as progressive has changed. In other words, in FDR's time, the New Deal progressivism, the progressive reforms that aim to benefit the middle class and the working class through regulating capital, the meaning of progressivism changed in the 60s to mean what my old professor Adolf Reed called racial democracy instead of social democracy. So where the idea is that democracy needs to have more of a social, inclusive character. Starting in the 60s, you get this idea coming out of the civil rights movement, for example, that democracy needs to become more inclusive in terms of racial constituencies, for example, and how that's a shift. So now what's considered progressive is, are you inclusive on identity politics lines? What's interesting about this is that the Democrats have always been the identity politics party, meaning they were the party of immigrants, they were the party of Catholics in the 19th century. The Republicans, on the other hand, actually emerged from a split in the old Whig Party. So the Whig Party split between the Republicans and the Know-Nothings, right, the nativists, the anti-Catholics. And, of course, also the Republicans incorporated the abolitionists, right? So, again, you had a kind of a progressive liberal versus a conservative liberal, because where did the Know-Nothings and the nativists come from? They came from this idea that it was the Anglo, the WASP tradition in the United States that was the guarantor of liberalism, whereas the Catholics represented the conservatism of continental Europe, of the Pope, right? That they were a threat to liberal democracy because they were too reactionary, too conservative. That's where that came from. Whereas the Democrats, through their machine politics in the cities, absorbed the immigrants. And at that time, again, a lot of the immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe were Catholics. Also, a lot of Catholics from Germany, from Southern Germany. And what happened with the black voters is that they went from being a voting bloc of the Republican Party to becoming a voting bloc of the Democratic Party. And how did that happen? It happened when they moved from the south to the north and got absorbed into the machine politics of the northern cities, the Democratic Party. The civil rights movement was a crisis with respect to this. It was a crisis of not only the South, but it was also the transformation of the South, the industrialization of the South. That's why Montgomery, Alabama was a site, because it was an industrial city. But also, and this is where, of course, the civil rights movement hit its roadblock, in the North, meaning what were the problems in incorporating the black population into the ethnic machine constituency politics of the Democratic Party. Eventually they figured it out, however, right? So that now blacks are a Democratic voting bloc. And it's understood that that's what progress means, right? Progress means you get the black vote, regardless of the fact that black voters can be conservative on many issues. So one example that I like to use about the Clintons, Bill and Hillary Clinton, in terms of conflicting, competing commitments that they had to progressivism, of course they supported gay rights, gay marriage. They always supported this. But publicly, they had to be against it because they were afraid of losing black votes for a long time. And that's why it took Obama to really bring it home, because he got both the black vote and the gay rights agenda connected in a way that in the 80s and 90s, it was always the blacks in the Democratic Party who always shot down all the gay rights measures. For instance, in Chicago, it was the black aldermen who shot down all the ordinances that attempted to be passed to institute gay rights. So Obama solved that problem. But again, that's what progressivism means today. It means identity politics. It means managing the rainbow coalition of identity concerns. That's a very different definition of what progressivism looked like as an issue, whether it was the antitrust regulation or the Social Security New Deal reforms, which Theodore Roosevelt had advocated in 1912. He advocated all of these things in 1912, but they had to wait until 1932. FDR, was a great admirer of his distant cousin and uncle-in-law, Theodore Roosevelt, and so he was just sort of waiting in the wings until the opportunity of the Great Depression to institute Theodore Roosevelt's platform from 1912. Again, social democracy, however understood, the social question is what Marxists used to call it, the class question, the working class, meaning what kind of society do we live in when you have abject poor people doing the work, right? That's like a social crisis. Versus racial democracy, what came out of the 1960s, and now the Democrats are attempting to absorb Latinos as a voting bloc. So being progressive means being pro-immigrant, right? Which again raises some interesting things that Bernie Sanders raised in his campaign. He said, well, open borders, open immigration is actually a neoliberal agenda for the rich. It's not for the working class. And he got shot down for that. Why? Because articulating that as a threat to what the Democrats now call progressivism. So it changes, is really the bottom line.
Yeah, so something interesting, I think, that's come from this most recent discussion is kind of a similarity between, not only Teddy Roosevelt and Trump, this idea, but also you can kind of see the dynamic at play in the crisis of the Republican Party around the Civil War, and the Democrats during that era of the Civil War, kind of this, basically kind of the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, imperial era that you talked about in the essay, where you have, in the Republican Party, the crisis of liberalism kind of being battled out between kind of the two sides, and then in the Democratic Party, as a symptom of that, the middle class, petty bourgeois politics of, basically 19th century identity politics via immigration, or immigrants at that time. And something similar seems to be happening today, but I think the crisis of liberalism itself is much more obscure, and it's hard to tell how it's actually taking place within the Republican Party or within politics at all, and if this is a similar situation to kind of the Civil War era crisis of liberalism, then what, for example, the Democratic Party in the Civil War era was it represented the conservative answer to that, but also the necessity of meeting the crisis of liberalism via Marxism or socialism in a way. And I guess I was wondering if there's what we can learn from the present change.
Let me unpack that a little bit. So historically, the post-Civil War era was ruled by the Republicans, and that rule by the Republicans grew old. It grew incapable of really meeting the challenge in a way that the Democrats took advantage of, but through a fundamental transformation of the Democratic Party itself, namely through FDR. And so you have a kind of, that 70-year period between the Civil War and the New Deal. You have a bubbling up crisis. The populists started out outside of the party system, but then got folded into the Democratic Party system. Why? Because they were oppositional and because the Republicans were the ruling party. That's why that happened. And again, there was an attempt to transform the Republican Party into the Progressive Party, but it failed. And what happened instead was the Democrats started competing with the Republicans over progressivism, and that's what Woodrow Wilson represents. But the Republicans remained the dominant party. In other words, the return to normal after World War I was the return of the Republicans. So I wouldn't necessarily analogize directly Trump and Theodore Roosevelt, but I would say, again, Trump comes out of this crisis of the Republican Party, crisis of the Reagan coalition, as well as a disenchantment with the post-New Left identitarian Democrats. In other words, he comes after George W. Bush and Obama, after the manifest failures of what Trump always likes to say, the last 17 years. Right? It comes out of the crisis of both parties. Bernie Sanders, of course, who's not a Democrat, ran as a candidate in the Democratic Party out of the same crisis. In other words, out of a crisis of the two parties as presently constituted, out of the crisis of neoliberalism. Why I raised, because I've written previously about the crisis of neoliberalism, why I wrote this piece in particular on the Gilded Age was to say, well, let's look all the way back. In other words, what is the United States, really? And I took as my starting point the Glenn Beck hysteria around Trump, where he said, oh my God, we're the founding fathers are being defeated by the progressives. This totally overwrought historical imagination. And I said, okay, well, what's that about? Especially because when Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio conceded defeat to Trump in the primaries, they both said they were opposed to Trump's socialism. Right? So Ted Cruz said he's going to continue his fight against socialism. He's going to continue the fight against the socialism of the Democratic Party, and now he's going to be fighting against the socialism of Trump. And I thought, okay, well, what's that about? I felt like the Glenn Beck articulation was a lot sharper because socialism, this is a kind of catch-all phrase, meaning for them fascism is socialism, Soviet Union, red fascism, totalitarianism, that's what socialism means. So why not take the Glenn Beck point on board instead, which is freedom versus progress, meaning what is the United States? Essentially, what is the United States? Is it the United States of 1776, or is it the United States of 1912? Obviously, it's the United States of both. It's obviously both. And there's also a third United States in the mix, namely the United States of 1860, of Lincoln and the Civil War. Now, again, are we suffering from the unfinished revolution of 1776? Kind of. What we're really suffering from, however, is the failure of Reconstruction. And what killed Reconstruction was the 1873 panic, the depression of the 1870s. And what gave rise to progressivism was the depression of the 1890s. So when you think about, okay, how did American politics change? It changed as a function of things that happened 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, or a little bit more than 100 years ago. It certainly changed with respect to the capitalist political response to those changes. So Beck is right about progressivism, that progressivism is our reality. He just complains about it, right? As if you can somehow undo it, right? As if you can go back to 1776 America. No, you can't. And why can't you? Because of capitalism. Meaning George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were not dealing with capitalism. Neither was Abraham Lincoln. But Theodore Roosevelt was. And so in the illustration for the article in the Platypus Review, I include Mount Rushmore. Meaning, which of these figures doesn't belong, right? It's Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. And you're like, did Theodore Roosevelt build this monument as like a narcissistic monument to himself? Was he like Trump that way? Well, no. The monument was actually made after Theodore Roosevelt died. Like long after. It wasn't conceived of by Theodore Roosevelt at all. And yet, long after Theodore Roosevelt was president, it was clear to people that those were the four founding fathers of the United States. Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt. And it was actually built during FDR's time. And so, although conceived before FDR was president, conceived in the late 1920s. And I thought, okay, so who is this? Who is this bespectacled, because he's the one wearing glasses, right? Character in the background, because he's the most recessive figure in the monument.
He's the one nobody knows. I remember in school learning, the names of the faces on Mount Rushmore, and I could never remember the fourth one, because what on earth did Theodore Roosevelt do?
Well, it turned out he did a lot more than we think. In other words, he gave us the political, economic system that we actually live under much more so than Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln did, actually. And, he also represents all sorts of failures with respect to that. So famously, he invited Booker T. Washington to a state dinner at the White House and got roasted for it politically. Because, again, Booker T. Washington was the leader of the black Republicans, and Republicans had a black voting base. They also didn't just have a voting base, they actually had a whole job trusting structure. In other words, there were all sorts of black federal employees throughout the United States put in place by the Republicans, right? And so they were part of the machine. They were a real constituency. And that only ceased to be the case when capitalism changed and the sociology of the black community changed, and they had to make their way in the North rather than in the South. So in the South, blacks had federal positions throughout this whole period, including in the Jim Crow lynching era. And so, again, famously, Woodrow Wilson resegregated Washington, D.C., or segregated, I should say, because it wasn't really segregated. Segregation really took place fairly late. It wasn't just continuous with the Civil War. It actually happened fairly late, and Woodrow Wilson did a lot in the interest of segregation as a Democrat, as a racial conservative, again, in ways that actually were against what the Republicans did. In other words, the Republicans had this black middle class in D.C. as part of their machine. And Woodrow Wilson attacked that by segregating D.C. when he came into office as president. So there's a lot of forgotten history here, and also, but it's a history of failure. In other words, obviously there's a projected reform that only gets realized under FDR, but there's also standing the failure of the Black Party, the Republican Party, to really successfully prosecute the results of the Civil War through Reconstruction and its aftermath, and conceding to this Democrat, middle-class conservative racial reaction that took place throughout this period in the Jim Crow era.
Do you know if Hamid's coming?
I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, we can continue. It's 3 p.m., so it should be the next show, but he's not here yet, so we can just keep going if you want. Because we no dead air.
Right.
Yeah, he's not here yet.
Yeah,
one last point that I'd make, perhaps, is when thinking about, again, what kind of society do we live in? Where does the politics of the society come from? Thinking about the deep history, remarkably little has changed politically in terms of the actual structures. How the structures are handled has changed, but the structures themselves, in other words, the increased role of the federal government, the increased role of the state in general with respect to capitalism, again, the welfare state bureaucracy, all of these things, the kind of redistribution of capital, both among capitalists and between the capitalists and the rest of the population. These structures were put in place in the early 20th century and remain with us today. The fundamental structures are the same, even if the parties have changed and the way the parties appeal to the electorate have changed. Still, we live in this political situation that isn't, the Constitution of 1787. It's not that, the original constitutional order, but it's that constitutional order fundamentally transformed as it was interpreted in the early 20th century. And so when you think about, okay, again, what kind of world do we live in? What do we expect from the government? How are political battles fought out in this domain? It's from a reality that's 100 or more years old at this point, but not 200, 250 years old, right? It's not that old, right? It's a capitalist politics that we live in, not some ancient liberal democracy from the 18th century. And again, Glenn Beck in his Hysteria helped call attention to that, and I thought to myself, okay, let's pursue that. As it turned out, and I'll make a plug for this, Ken Burns, who's otherwise a somewhat dubious documentarian, I don't like his documentary on the Civil War especially, but his Civil War on the Roosevelts, his documentary on the his Civil War, his documentary on the Roosevelts.
About the Roosevelts
It's
fighting each other.
They do fight each other a great deal. But it's on the three Roosevelts. It's on Teddy Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite niece, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who married Eleanor Roosevelt, so they're all related, but distantly related. The two wings of the Roosevelt family. It's very good at capturing specifically this moment in history, right? The turn of the 20th century and the early 20th century. It actually follows Eleanor Roosevelt. The full series follows Eleanor Roosevelt all the way up through the 60s, which she lived until. But especially the early episodes on Theodore Roosevelt were very eye-opening. A lot of present-day historiography on this period recognizes that Theodore Roosevelt was seeking to avoid a revolution. And, he was paying attention to things like Germany of the same period and the rise of the SPD in Germany, and the Socialist Party in the United States was stronger than socialism has ever been ever since, both electorally and socially, through its civic action. And he looked at that and he said, okay, well, what's going to become of this society? We can't do the old style liberalism anymore. Even though he wanted to, surely. Reality was that corporate capitalism, second industrial revolution capitalism, had grown beyond what liberal democracy could handle in the old way. So it needed to be changed. And when we understand these political crises, whether back then with progressivism, with the New Deal, or with the 1960s New Left, the New Deal coalition crisis, the rise of neoliberalism, and now the crisis of the two parties, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, we need to understand this as an opportunity, not so much for socialism, because there's no socialism. I wish that there were. But it's an opportunity for changing liberal democracy. And whenever that happens, people always call it fascism. So the Communist Party called FDR a fascist in 1932. Of course, the neoliberals, I remember Herbert Marcuse, Frankfurt School thinker, he said about Ronald Reagan, he said, the only people who would call for cutting back the welfare state are fascists, and so advocating that should be made illegal. Right? Like, only fascists would call for cutting the welfare state. So he had no clue of Milton Friedmanism or anything like that. Like, that was just fascism. And now Trump's a fascist. Right? So it's always fascism. Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 was the most dangerous man in America who was going to destroy constitutional democracy, because he said that if the Constitution hasn't kept pace with capitalism, then we might have to sometimes go against the Constitution, because he said famously that the Constitution was made for the people weren't made for the Constitution. And so, of course, people said this is a threat to freedom, the threat to liberal democracy.
That's the Glenn Beck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
And so thinking of like today as a crisis of the Reagan coalition, Glenn Beck is like in that moment like a voice of the strict like constitutional conservatives of the Reagan coalition.
Right. Exactly. Which means constitutional liberal, conservative liberal, as opposed to progressivism. Famously, FDR followed very closely in Teddy Roosevelt's footsteps when the Supreme Court threatened to overrule the New Deal. Roosevelt said, well, then I'll just add 3 more justices to the Supreme Court, because there's actually no provision for how many Supreme Court justices there are, so he could have done that. And so his congressional as well as Supreme Court opponents backed down, because they realized he would just pack the court and just get his way.
18th premier of FDR.
Yeah, because in fact it's not in the Constitution how many Supreme Court justices there should be.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Just answer.
Right. So again, it was Constitution be damned. We have to do this. Right. Capitalism demands it.
classical liberalism was untenable.
That's
the
right.
question was,
Right.
well, this is like when people phrase it as, will the 20th century be the century of Lenin or the century of Wilson?
Exactly.
Is the missing piece in that is actually classical liberalism.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the fact that progressivism came out of the Liberal Party, came out of the Republican Party. That's what the Republicans were. They were the liberals,
Mm-hmm.
and the Democrats were the conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
That changed with FDR.
Mm-hmm.
And again, what that raises is, well, what about progressivism? Right? So you had this moment where you had a kind of liberal progressivism versus a conservative progressivism, namely Teddy Roosevelt versus Woodrow Wilson. And so that's a really obscure distinction between them. But as I indicated earlier, one way of thinking about that is the fact that blacks changed as an electorate between the
Mm-hmm.
Republicans and the Democrats. So Republicans were the black party, Theodore Roosevelt, versus the racist Woodrow Wilson. Right, the conservative,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you can illustrate it that way. You can say, well, how was Woodrow Wilson a conservative relative to FDR, to Teddy Roosevelt? Because he was a racial conservative, and because already industrial capitalism was changing the conditions for blacks. Already there were no longer just sharecroppers,
Mm-hmm.
and the question was, how do you assimilate a new working class and middle class black population? Woodrow Wilson was like, we don't. We segregate them. Whereas Theodore Roosevelt was like, no, we carry on from Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. In other words, we represent blacks as liberals. Right? This has all become very obscure history. And in some ways, the black population became supporters of the Democrats really only after 1960. Meaning it was a real toss-up whether to vote for Nixon or JFK in 1960. Because in the 50s, Eisenhower and Nixon, they were the civil rights people against the Democrats. So there was the Republicans who were trying to pass civil rights legislation in Congress in the 50s, and the Democrats were voting against it. So Eisenhower and Nixon were supporting civil rights in the 50s. It changes in the 60s, and that's JFK and LBJ. Right, mark that change. They tried to assimilate the new black electorate, and that gives us the world that we live in now.
So,
because it was still true under FDR, blacks were not supporters
Mm-hmm.
of the Democrats.
well, and speaking to how, obscure this history is, it kind of seems like, at least until perhaps this last year, that history began with, FDR in, the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And only now that kind of alignment of liberal democracy and of progressive liberalism and conservative liberalism is...
Fraying.
Yeah.
Falling apart.
Is, up for grabs.
Uh-huh.
That kind of the old...
Before Trump was elected, there was a New Yorker article called The Art of the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
That was about how Trump was like FDR.
Oh, because of the infrastructure plan?
Yeah, the infrastructure plan, and also just his anti-Wall Street vibe, right, that he gave off. Again, his opposition to entrenched neoliberalism. Right, but again, does that make him an anti-neoliberal? Does it make him a fascist? Or does it make him a post-neoliberal? Meaning he thinks we need to make some changes.
So this is what it means to say that Trump is realigning the center. It's
Mm-hmm.
that he's realigning progressive liberalism and conservatism.
Absolutely, exactly. He's saying what needs to be changed. So I was just reading today about how the CEO of Apple, he was asked, are you making these changes, reinvesting in the U.S., repatriating capital? Are you doing that because of Trump's policies? And he said, we are, but we probably would have done it anyway. But he's making it easier for us to do it. Right? Because Trump is taking credit for this recapitalization of the United States, repatriation of capital. And again, the Apple CEO, he doesn't want to be seen as a Trump supporter.
Yeah.
So he had to sort of equivocate and say yes
Strange
and no.
bedfellows.
Right. He's saying, well, we would have done it anyway, but Trump's making it easier. Right? And so again, is that progress? It's as progressive as any kind of capitalism is.
It's
meaning
progress in something.
it's progress in, job creation, whatever you want to call it, right? The new needs of the economy. So, again, I would put under doubt the idea that any capitalism is progressive. However, capitalism does change, right? It encounters crisis and it tries to solve its crisis, and it necessarily changes. Whether those changes are progressive or not, progressive from what standpoint?
Right. Yeah. What does progressivism mean?
Yeah.
In terms of like just mere change versus like whether that change is actually being led in any meaningful sense.
Right. Does it lead to socialism?
Right.
Right. So that's another thing that I wanted to sort of call attention to, was the idea that actually socialism was opposed to progressivism. Debs called TR a psychotic. He said he's a psychotic megalomaniac. In other words, he described TR the same way Bernie Sanders would describe Trump. Right? And, so again, the idea that somehow progressivism is a step towards socialism, actually it's not. It's not. Not only was progressivism opposed to socialism, but socialism was also opposed to progressivism. Whereas today, we call progressivism socialism. And actually, that's a big concession to neoliberalism.
Neoliberalism as opposed to Fordism?
Yeah, I guess in Fordism, people were less concerned about, are we conceding to socialism? They would have said, well, no, we're not, because we're still liberal, we still have civil rights, we still have democracy. But they were less concerned about it. Everything that seems opposed to neoliberalism is called fascism, and fascism is itself understood as a form of socialism, National Socialism. So these things get kind of screwed up. And so the left, in its anti-neoliberalism, actually concedes a great deal. Because it somehow sees progressivism as some midway between capitalism and socialism. It isn't. It's just capitalism. Right. It raises the question of what is the relationship of progressive capitalism to socialism? It's not straightforward. And also, it's not via populism either.
Okay, we're going to play another PSA, I think, real quick. No. Thank you. Okay, so the DJ after us
He called in and said that he's caught up at work and can't come in.
So we
we
can
have to be here
continue
till-
talking if you want, or we can...
I was supposed to meet with Sunit.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can
that's
just play
fine.
music. So we can just, end it. Is this not going? Hello?
Hi, I'm Jeff Gordon, and this year you'll find me not only racing on the